Good morning, fellows. Welcome back to Manhood University. It's time for this week's lesson of Manhood 401, and I don't want to waste any time, so let's jump right into it. We had a great lesson last week, and it was about men having vision. And a few weeks ago, we talked about our role in confronting things that are wrong. So today, I want you to consider those two lessons as we talk about a man's role in creating, defining, sustaining, and changing culture. Now, if you've ever scratched your head when a new employee or student or church member asks, "What's the culture here?" then you are part of the audience that I want to address today. Now, there are a couple more audiences, but I'll get to those in a little while. And before we can go anywhere, it may be helpful to define what culture is. So the basic definition of culture is a way of thinking, behaving, or working that exists in a place or organization. Culture can have a more granular definition, depending on how you apply it. Another definition would break it down as the customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits of a racial, religious, or social group. And there's a more broad definition, that is the characteristic features of everyday existence shared by people in a place or time. And that, of course, it applies to things like popular culture or Southern culture. Gentlemen, a key point about all of those definitions is that they are morally ambiguous. No right or wrong have been attached. They are defining what culture is, but not what the culture is. The interesting thing about culture is no matter how you define it, there are building blocks necessary for the creation of any culture. While there are a few dozen theories on how those building blocks come together, I think that for this class, we're going to follow an evolution that most will be able to understand. And that starts with our words. So our words create thoughts. Those thoughts produce feelings, and those feelings produce actions. Actions, gentlemen, become habits, and our habits become our character. Now, character breeds climate. And climate breeds culture. Okay, now it's time to reveal the other two audiences. Wait for it. Leaders and followers. Listen, Romans 10:17 tells us that faith comes by hearing. The words that we say as leaders, they create thoughts in others, just like the words we hear, the things we allow to be said to us create thoughts. So you can view this on either side, really, whether you're the leader or the follower. And followers, remember, Professor Boston taught us that people should have to earn the right to educate you. For our leaders, for this lesson to have any real value, you must either start by believing that you have a responsibility to define the culture where you are, maintain it if it's a good culture, or change it if it's gone awry. So let me ask you, what is your culture? At home, at work, in academia, in your community, at church? What kinds of words are you speaking? And what are you allowing to be spoken, unchecked, where you're supposed to be the one in authority? As a man of influence, what are you allowing into your space? What kinds of music are you listening to? What TV shows or other societal elements that are counter to the things you know to be right have begun to invade your space of thought? What do you think about? What comes to mind when you hear those things from the TV or the radio? Are your words a byproduct of the thoughts you received from another source? Was it a good source or a bad source? What thoughts are your words inspiring? What do the men around you gain from having you in their lives? Now, what thoughts do you act out? Do your actions align with your words? Or have you made excuses or given yourself permission to do the things you want to do? What habits do you have? Think about that a second, because you may be thinking about smoking or drinking or drugs and miss the other things. We have lots of habits, and some of them are masquerading as impulsive, random things because we've never noticed them. So, how have these habits affected your character? Now, this can be a tricky one. You see, once you make excuses for things, you'll rarely notice that they've become a habit for you. And so your character gets a smudge because your first response is to defend the behavior. This usually happens one of two ways. First, you will condemn something that is wrong. And then someone will come along and say, well, what about that thing you're doing? And then you say, well, I only do that on the weekends or with friends or not that often, or I can quit whenever I want. You, my friend, just lost credibility. But remember, character is who you are when no one's looking. So the second way your character gets tested is that after condemning what you see as wrong, unbeknownst to you, you are observed making bad choices. To be honest, you rarely get to know firsthand when people have lost faith in you. When they've lost faith in your character, they're not going to rush up and tell you. We told you in earlier lessons that you don't get to decide who's looking up to you. Now, once your character is established, good or bad, your climate is created. The climate is the residue of your character, whether at home, school, or work. As a man in authority, the climate is created because your character has impact on the people around you such that they respond to you with such a degree of predictability that norms are established and they become the way we've always done it. Culture. Now, I think someone just had an aha moment there. You see, culture sets in when we're so used to the habits and the climate that when offered a different way of doing things, we reject the notion, even if it's better. So can you see how solidifying a positive culture can be a great defense against corrosive personalities and toxic behaviors? Okay. Hey, I think we got a question in the back, which is kind of weird since there's no one here. But yeah, young man wearing the Trouble T. Roy shirt, he's asking me how we can affect culture. Hey, that's a great question. And it really depends on where your organization is already. So first, if no culture exists, you have to create and define culture. In your home, that's as simple as deciding that you'll eat together as a family. You'll pray in the mornings. You will draw a line for the music or the TV elements that you allow in. Another way of putting it is, what outside cultures are you willing to let to define your inside culture? If you're trying to define the culture in your home, you can't afford the mixed signals that popular culture is giving your children. Drawing that line is not easy, but it's necessary. In your company or your job, you decide what you want your business, department, or division to stand for, and you emulate those characteristics first while asking your employees to follow your lead. Remember, when you stray from the path, you give them permission to ignore the very changes that you're trying to make. At school, if you're a leader, then you are a mixture of the parent and the boss, defining what's acceptable based on personal and professional standards, and being ever mindful that what you allow in your presence is your standard. You'll also be fighting with popular culture because a lot of permission is given there without any real guidance. Now at church, if you don't already have a culture, you're just not doing this right. We'll get back to you when we talk about sustaining culture. In your community, unless you just built a house in the last month, you already have a culture. You just have to tap into it. Fair enough? Now, I want to move on to those places where a positive culture exists, because those are the places where men have a definitive role in sustaining that culture. We cannot go on autopilot. Culture sustainment manifests itself in different ways, but you can find near symmetry in how it's done in all areas of your life. At home, remember, you've worked so hard to build the culture, so now you have to be on the front lines of defense, keeping the negative elements, also known as counterculture, from creeping in. Like any organization, the introduction of new members and new information creates a need to reinforce your culture. Your children will add friends, and as a father, you have to find a way to teach that we can accept that a person or family does things differently than us without adopting that practice in our homes. Is it easy? No. Deal with it though, because the coward's way out is letting negative outside cultures wreak havoc in your home. Notice how I said negative. You need discernment to know when an outside element is negative, or conversely, when it can enhance the already positive culture in your family. Remember, your first ministry is your family. So if you can sustain a positive culture there, you are set up for success in every area of your life. In fact, you can almost see the parallels as we shift into your school culture, keeping the positive elements of the culture by reinforcing them, and then adding a few things like enforcing the rules and standards. That's going to help you. Listen, if you don't allow gum chewing from the kids who are always in trouble, you can't allow it from the kids who are never in trouble. And along those same lines, we can move right into your job or your business. The tendency is for a new employee sometimes to want to come in and tell you how they did it back at company X or back in department Y. And you have to be on your toes, squashing the things that won't work and willing to incorporate the things that will, all in an effort to make your business more successful. Now, your church had a positive culture when it started. I know this because the Apostle Paul made certain of that when he planted some of the first churches. For men to keep the positive culture in our churches, they have to sustain it by showing up. I hate to say it, but the elements necessary to sustain a positive culture are there, but a lot of us would rather be somewhere else on Sunday mornings. Gentlemen, half of winning is showing up. In your communities, positive culture is rare. So when you have it, man, we have to choose to be involved. That's how we keep it that way. In both churches and communities, you can apply the cultural sustainment techniques from the family and also the ones we do in school and business with a few modifications, and you'll see positive results. Now we got to get to the heavy lifting, and that's changing culture. There are two primary reasons to change a culture. It's either outdated or it's toxic. Notice that both reasons point to the reality that the current culture is not working. Changing a culture involves convincing people that the current culture is counterproductive, anemic, or toxic. Defining and creating a culture to replace it, convincing people to go with the new culture, and staying on top of it once implemented to ensure that your organization doesn't fall back into the old culture. Now, those who've had extensive leadership experience will recognize these steps as near facsimiles of the change management process. Remember, we said that good or bad, an established culture will resist the attempts to change it. So you start with words. Those words have to be deliberate so that they can get people thinking about change. Once you get them on board, they will surprise you with acting on a few ideas even when they're not so sure of the outcomes. Believe it or not, as an influential leader, it's just words and actions for you then on out. You have to constantly reinforce the good behavior and make sure that you are always seen living the example. And don't be afraid to name your culture. You can weave it into your mission or vision statement, your ethical education, or even in how you talk to your children. At the end of the day, culture is the how and why of what we do. And if you're not part of it, it will proceed, good or bad, without you. Consider this your midterm, gentlemen. Go learn the culture of your family, school, business, church, or community. Figure out it's positive or if it's negative, if it's non-existent or stagnant, and then make a decision about how you'll take your role as men seriously. We must see creating, preserving, and if necessary, changing the culture as our responsibility, because that's just part of what men do. Hey, thank you all for tuning in this week, gentlemen. I will see you all back here next week. God bless you.